What are you doing?
Getting set up for the 5th edition D&D campaign I'm running tonight.
No, you're not. I'm running Vampire the Masquerade tonight.
We've got to work on this communicating beforehand thing. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unqualified Experts. I'm your host, Braden Gardner.
I'm your corrupt overlord.
And today we're going to talk about a topic that was requested by one of our patrons, and that's tips for being a good DM or game master.
Outstanding topic.
So, Shane, if you want to go ahead and start us off here.
Well, appropriately, I think one of the best things you can do as a DM, whether you're a beginner and it's your first campaign, or whether you've run for 10 years and you're experienced, is set the expectations early. This is such an easy step to forget, but oh man, you are opening yourself up to a world of headaches if you do. And this can be for in general. This can also help you create a campaign that starts off in a really unique or different way. The last campaign I actually ran for Braden and group, I had to get a very clear point A to point B. And look, we all hate railroads during a tabletop RPG game. It's not Ticket to Ride. You hate being forced from point A to point B because it's supposed to be a shared adventure. But since I had to have that initial prelude to get everybody on the same page, I just sat down and let them know, hey, first session, you guys, I'm just letting you know I'm going to railroad you because for story reasons, I have to get you from point A to point B. But I also told them, look, if you roll a bunch of perfect rolls, if you are doing the kind of rolling that should mess up a DM's story, I will reward you later. So by setting the expectation early, nobody was mad when the obvious railroading started happening. If anything, you guys seem to enjoy making my life even more miserable. Because since you knew you were ending up at Part B, you were trying all kinds of crap you usually know I would not let you get away with. And so it actually, by setting that expectations, not only was there no annoyance or anger from being railroaded, but it actually turned out to be a really fun and hilarious first session because you knew I wasn't going to kill you, so why not try to ramp that car despite never driving before? I still don't know how PJ made that save.
Your guess is as good as mine, but you know what? Sometimes the dice just give you one.
True, and so that's why I think setting expectations, it's just a good practice. It is a great way to make sure every campaign starts off on the right note.
Absolutely, and to add into that a little bit, this isn't necessarily something that you just do if you know that you're going to be forced to deviate from a more open storytelling method to something involving railroading. This is a good opportunity to also make sure that you're on the same page with your players as far as any rule changes that you are implementing or rule adaptations that you're adopting that are going to change rules as written to work within the world that you're operating in. You want to make sure that you're as upfront and transparent about those expectations before you start because it can impact things like character creation. Yeah. And it's also good for making sure that you're not running into, but the rules say this, and I built my character to do Y, and you're saying my character now does X. It's super important to make sure that any adaptations like that that are going to change the way that the game is played in any capacity are on the table up front.
Yeah, that still saves all the headaches, all the arguments later. And it's just a good way to set things off on the right foot to make sure everyone's on the same page. You don't want a player thinking that they're doing the heavy-duty, by-the-books, min-max dungeon crawling, and then you throw them a bunch of riddle and story for 6 sessions, because then their character just is not going to be able to get involved in the same way. And they almost certainly will have built their character differently had you been upfront with what you expected and what was coming up.
And the TLDR of all of that is basically going to boil down to gotcha moments suck. They're just not fun.
Yeah. The DM doesn't like dealing with them. The players don't like being caught by them. And set the expectations, you avoid at least the majority of them. And that's always a good way to give you the best chance of having a good game for everybody involved.
The other portion of that I would say is important for getting established early on, have a serious discussion with the players at the table about the overall mortality rate of a player character as well. Some players, like me, tend to invest really heavily in backstory and get attached to their characters. So it's important to be clear whether or not your campaign is going to allow for something like that up front, because that's another way to really create some bad feelings when a 30-second conversation could have saved them from multiple hours of work and preparation. That's going to die because the world decided that they did not want to play ball.
Yeah, glorified peasant golf is great if you know you're playing glorified peasant golf.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us into the next area of discussion for being a good DM as well, and that's to be prepared to have a good story, but plan it in broad strokes.
Yep.
If you're playing a peasant golf type game, you know that things are going to be pretty fast and loose from start to finish, and it's probably going to be an afternoon of sending commoners to their deaths. But if you're planning something more grandiose, if you're planning a 16 to 20 session campaign or a campaign that's going to span literal years, it's important to make sure that you're not forcing the story to go from point A to B to C by way of D, E, and F. You want to make sure that you're planning in very, very broad strokes. These are going to be key story points here, here, and here. And then let your players kind of help drive the story. Don't force them to go to point A. Let them choose their own route to get to the destination.
Yeah, and if you're a history major, you've heard that old saying that no plan survives contact with the enemy. And if you think that's true, being a DM for any group, they are never going to follow a step-by-step outline that you have set up for them. I mean, sometimes just out of spite, they will start going down random alleys, or that NPC who meant nothing, they will spend 3 hours learning every backstory as the villain, shady guy in the corner waves his arm trying to get their attention, and they're just not having it. Or in my case, you build this nice town to give them a safe haven from the swamp, and they spend 6 months running from plot because they refuse to go to town, period, end of statement.
That town sucks.
It's not that bad.
It was absolutely that bad.
And so along with the Broadstrokes, I kind of call mine like the floating method, where I'll know like a really cool celebration that's happening in the world. Like in their campaign, there was one where the city decided to deal with the Norse version of bad luck, where people just randomly die for no reason, where this insane luck just strikes all the time. So why not party and celebrate, because life is short. But I didn't know what was going to happen in the city they went to. I just knew, sometime during the campaign when they need a light moment, whatever city they're going to should have this celebration. Or I'll know there are certain characters or events that will take place, but it's not necessarily you have to get here by A, B, or C. I just know in my mind, here are certain characters, here is a certain event, here's a celebration, and it gives the players the ability to explore the world, find creative ways to get to places, and then you can actually read the campaign, like, okay, are they ready for a really serious dig-in moment? I will take this specific scenario I know about, introduce a new bad guy. Oh, did they get through a really dark part of the plot, and you kind of feel like they need some cheering up? Great, it is time to party and celebrate chaos magic, or the Halfling New Year. And by having these little events in your pocket, you can paint a really good picture the moment they show up to anywhere on your map, and you're not tied to forcing something into the campaign at the wrong time.
Absolutely, and if you do have a bit of trouble doing the broad strokes method, and you're one of those detail-oriented people, and I can often find myself in this category, who really wants to delve into the details of everything, save it for your characters. Save it for the NPCs that the party's going to come across. And that's going to really come into the next major tip that we want to go over, and that's making sure that you're crafting your characters with the same level of detail that you might be tempted to try and ram into a railroaded plot.
Yeah. Yep.
Basically, you want to make sure that you're going in and making sure your characters are memorable even after the session's over, even after the campaign's over. And there are a few different ways you can do that. Giving them specific personality traits or quirks is a great way to help separate them from random Joe Schmo drinking in a bar down the street. Taking the time to give them voices, which, and I know it's hard to do sometimes, and I've even heard excuses from myself basically saying, I'm really bad at voices, so I'm not going to bother doing them. But that's the wrong approach. You want to make sure that you're at least trying. Take a little time to practice it a little bit. And you don't have to be a voice actor. You don't have to be a Matt Mercer to create a memorable character. But just a couple little things like that can really take a character from a 7 out of 10 to a 9 or 10 out of 10 that your players are going to be talking about for years afterward is, hey, remember so-and-so? Weren't they just the most hilarious character ever? I still can't get over Commodore Hans's accent.
Yeah. I wasn't even in that campaign, and I know that character for life. Thank you, Ben, for breaking that. And one thing I learned even when studying writing was you don't have to have, like, if a character has a slight Irish accent, a lot of times I'd only try the Irish accent the first 2 or 3 lines. And in that point, it's kind of in the player's head. So as long as you do kind of a relative pace, they're kind of hearing the accent you already put out there. Just a little bit of effort, and the players will really dig in to try to fill in the gaps. They will appreciate that extra little step you took. And it gives them a little bit of detail to kind of paint a better picture of what these characters look like, what they sound like. And the little details like that really can make up a campaign. And I'll say this too, don't just do that with NPCs. I think one of the easiest mistakes you can make, and granted, when I'm feeling lazy, I have done this myself. It's easy in a D&D world to have a villain where they're evil because they're evil. That is so boring. It is just, yeah, let's go adventuring, let's go quest, let's go save the world. This is all part of a campaign. But the chances are really strong that villain is not going to be very memorable, and the campaign's going to suffer from it. There's an old saying that nobody is the villain of their own story. And I think that's really interesting if you take the time to have a villain who he or she believes they're the hero. They are right. Or if they're not right, they're at least justified in what they're doing. Imagine having a paladin in your party who's kneeling down to pray, or a cleric to their god. And the big bad they know they're chasing steps into the temple beside them, kneels down, and finishes the prayer. That is a holy crap moment, not only for the player, but you have the whole table paying attention at that point. Maybe he ruminates about the failure of the gods, or how he misses his faith. And here's the person you're supposed to be smashing, who suddenly has this unspoken tragedy in the background, who has a common trait with someone in your party they were not expecting. It throws an interesting curve. It makes him extremely memorable. And in just little ways, even if the party never gets the full backstory of the villain, just by knowing who the villain is, what they went through, what caused them to go the route they are, will make you play that character differently. They will have nuance. They will be much more alive than your flat, straight evil. And you are much more likely to have these really interesting moments. And I think one of my favorites from the campaign I ran for you guys was the Barbarian. They are sneaking into the city where the Barbarian trashed the continent, and they're expecting this big fight. They're expecting this vicious battle. And so I started singing. And they hear singing from the darkness, and then they drop the invisibility spell, and there's this room full of barbarians laughing and cheering these brave adventurers who came to kill them. And I will quote Old Man Callahan, looking at the rest of the table. This is not what I was expecting. What about you guys? And the confusion there was great as they got offered mead. Is it poisoned? No. And it's like, it's that memorable thing where they don't know why the reaction was like that from the Barbarian King. They never got the backstory to that. But it creates such an interesting moment that we're still talking about it 2 years later.
Absolutely. It's a big deal. And if it helps at all with actually putting your idea into words, treat it like improv comedy or an improv session where you're building on what the other people at the table are doing. That's a great way to kind of bridge from, well, where do I even start to, oh, okay, I'm going with the flow, I'm exhibiting traits A, B, and C the best that I can to convey points 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, and that ability to improv even after doing the background for your characters, don't underestimate how useful that can happen. Some of my quote-unquote most brilliant moments was one player looking at another, wait a minute, does that mean we're related? I thought, oh, they misunderstood that. And I thought about the story so far, like, oh, yeah, that can work. They're related now. I am totally running with this random idea they threw out, like I planned it all along. I didn't. I admit that now, but it it worked so well, it looked so good at the time, it worked. And so in those rare moments where the opportunities come up, if you have a well fleshed out world, that is not going to shake you off the main plot quest. That's going to allow you to jump on the opportunity because you have fleshed out the rest so well. Anything else to add to the interesting villain?
No, that pretty well covers it, I think. You've actually got a pretty good knack for doing that, so I don't have anything to add.
Nice. And so it kind of brings us in, because we touched a little bit on this, with that seeing the opportunity and seizing it. Another tip I have is read the table. And this can happen at multiple levels. And it's something that you're not going to be good at it the first time you're DM, and that's perfectly fine. And you may not be great at the next few times. And even when you're good at it, you'll have sessions where you just drop the ball. You're human. Congratulations. You know, it's fine. But reading the table, there were a few different ways you can take this. One is, off the bat, try to get a sense for what type of players you have at the table. You know, is half the table pure dungeon crawling? Is that the background they come from? Where it's a very Pathfinder stat, min-max, you know, kill the baddies, take the treasure. And then do you have half the table where it's intense storytelling, a lot of backstory. Combat comes up, but it's almost an afterthought. By seeing if you have a table that's all one type of player or another, it lets you adjust the campaign a little bit. Now, it doesn't mean you have to cater to your players all the time. That would lead to a lot of dull campaigns. And I know as a player, I really appreciate the ability to try something new. And I believe that most of us are that way. You're willing to give it a shot. But asking a dungeon crawler to go heavy Sherlock Holmes is a bit of a jump. You kind of need the baby side of the pool there. And so maybe if you have a table with people used to doing the heavy combat, you maybe throw in a few more battles or fights than you were originally expecting. If you have a table that, you know, was heavy into the problem solving, hasn't done much combat, you can maybe dial back one or two confrontations and give them a peaceful way to solve it. They're just little ways you can kind of read how to adjust the campaign. And especially after you do 2 or 3 sessions, that can be a really good skill to head off potential problems you see coming up.
I completely agree. That's actually a really solid tip. And one other thing that I think really plays well hand in hand with that particular tip is knowing when to give your players a little extra latitude to do something.
Yep.
Or put more simply or colloquially, know when to apply the rule of cool.
Yep.
Nobody really likes to be told no. I mean, especially if you're playing in a fantasy setting where you're playing up the idea that anything is possible. You have access to magic, you have access to items that do cool things. No really just doesn't fit into that narrative super well. But it can be a bit of a tightrope to walk as well, because you don't want to set yourself up to let your players run roughshod all over you,
Yep.
or let the rules lawyers dictate the terms of your campaign to you. Both of those can be really tough situations to work with, and they can honestly occur on both sides of the DM screen.
Absolutely.
You can run into issues where you have a DM who is really focused on doing things in a very specific way, A, B, and C, and they aren't willing to adapt or flex at all. Even if the characters have a really cool creative solution that might stretch the bounds of what a rule allows or just doesn't have a case example in the book, it happens. And giving them the leeway to actually be able to go ahead and try their cool thing, or to give them, that's a neat idea, roll for it.
Yep.
And then actually get the table invested in, hey, this is actually kind of a nice outside the box sort of thought, and then letting the consequences of trying it flow from there.
And I think that's a good point. The roll for it is also always a good way to go, because at that point, it's a fair 50-50 chance. If the dice roll is good, all right, let's roll with this, see what happens. If it's bad, all right, the dice roll was there. And if the person's really invested, depending on the system, they may ask if they can use a re-roll or inspiration. And at that point, if they're that invested in trying something, that might be all the more reason to let them try. If you're a relatively new DM and you're not, this sounds a little bit overwhelming, one of the good tips I picked up from my Pathfinder campaign I played, our DM had what he called the spotlight rule. Each player at some point was going to have a session or a half a session where they absolutely got to shine. He knew their backstory, he had been setting some things up, he knows what you can do well. He watched the dice rolls, so in my case he made sure there was no dice rolling for mine, because I was going to screw it up. I had a dice that would not roll above a 5 that campaign. It was amazing. It would have been funnier if it wasn't me. But
Totally fair.
That spotlight rule is a good way to go. It's like, okay, the fighter hasn't had his moment yet because it's been magic happy the last few sessions. Let's give him that moment where maybe there's a room where all magic fails, and suddenly the armor guy comes out, cracks his knuckle, pulls his swords, and now is his moment to shine. And just think of these little times where each person has their ability to showcase something. It's a really cool way to make sure everyone has at least one really good memory. And it's not always going to be at a time that you would have predicted. I remember Chris playing Constantine in our campaign. One of his proudest moments, he used his inspiration to suplex a full-size grizzly bear in the middle of a bar fight. You know what? If that makes you happy and that's the memory you want for years, I will absolutely let you use inspiration to roll for that.
Absolutely.
And it was his moment where he got to shine, and you bet the NPCs were buying him ale after that. I would buy ale to anyone who back suplexed a grizzly. And so just having that spotlight rule, along with the rule of cool, can give you kind of a nice little guideline as you're figuring your way through each campaign, which is going to be different.
Yeah, and if you're not sure of whether you should be applying something like the rule of cool, and it's not the spotlight isn't necessarily on a given player at the time, one thing to ask is this going to grant a meaningful mechanical advantage to the player asking to do this thing that's outside the bounds a little bit? If the answer is no, you should almost always just let them give it a try, unless it just flat out doesn't make sense. If the answer is yes, then you kind of have to weigh it a little more to kind of see, is this going to be something that makes sense for them to do? Should this be thrown in as something that's going to take 2 turns instead to fit more within the action system that you're playing with?
Yep.
So on and so forth.
And there's nothing wrong in the middle of a campaign with saying, give me a minute to think about that. Because at the end of the day, nothing, and I'm convinced this, nothing improves your improv skills like running a campaign for a bunch of players who think outside the box. And they are more than willing to give you a minute to think about everything that goes into things. They do not expect you to have every answer right off the bat. Especially if you have chaotic players like me or Nathan in your campaign. you can have your minute or two if you needed to think about it.
But that pretty well sums up the rule of cool. So now we want to hear from you.
Yep. What are your tips to DMs, whether they're new, just getting their second or third campaign, or an old hand? What are the fun tricks you have to make sure your players have a blast and just love the campaign? So please leave your stories in the comments. We read all of them. If you haven't subscribed and liked this video already, please do. You can check us out on Patreon and check out our other episodes. And until next time, happy gaming!
See you next time.
If you like what you just saw, please support us by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more great gaming content.